Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Rabbi Adam Kligfeld's weekly Rashi study class.
We're on the third chapter of the book of Shemot, and I believe that we completed the Rashi on verse 14, on Ayeh Asher Ahiyeh, right? We talked about this notion of, also coming in, of what's interesting about God's name being described that way, just on the pshat level. What do the words mean? I will be that I will be who I will be when I will be. It's hard to know what the pshat means. And Rashi, quoting a midrash, interpolating into that comment a conversation between Moshe and God, with Moshe saying to God one of the many times that Moshe kind of puts a mirror up to God and says to God, this is how you're appearing in this scene, is it want to appear. And basically saying that Asher Ahiyeh suggests that God is promising presence and comfort now during this moment of travail and in any future moment of travail. And Moshe says back to God, why should you let them know about future travails, future oppressions? This is enough right now. It'll be overwhelming to them. God says, you're right, essentially. So instead of telling them that Eheyeh, Asher Eheyeh, I will be who I will be, sent you to them, tell them, Eheyeh, sent you to them. I will be. Whoever I am to you right now, that is the one who's going to take you out. Rashi glosses over what's odd about the name itself and not Elohei Avotechem, right? The God of your ancestors. Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Yaakov. God doesn't go there, at least not initially. It's this sense of divine being and presence is going to be the name that Moshe is told to invoke when he goes to the Israelites. And then, as someone pointed out 2 weeks ago, that's not even what happens, right? So when Moshe comes before the Israelites and they have this encounter, Moshe does not say, Eheyeh sent me to you, nor does God say, Eheyeh Asher Eheyeh sent me to you. There's a different encounter, but we're not at that part yet. So were there any final or extra thoughts on that before we jump into the next verse? I don't think we've read verse 15 yet as a class. Anyone? Okay. Let's see. Sue, do you want to show your video and read verse 15? And everyone, we're in chapter 3, verse 15 of the book of Shemot. If you're in the Torah Chaim Chumash that we have, it's on page Lamed Dalid, but any Chumash, chapter 3, verse 15. Sue, you there?
I am. I'm a little, I wasn't, okay, wait, just give me 1 second here. Chapter 3,
Sure.
Verse 15. Vayomer? No. Vayomer? No.
Vayomer, yes. Verse 15, Tet Vav.
Verse 15. Why do I have that we were going to be on 16? No? Wrong?
You read verse 15, folks? I don't think you did.
Okay. Vayomer od Elohim el Moshe, Ko tomar el bnei Israel, el bnei Israel Adonai. Elohei avotenu Elohei Abraham Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, shalachani alechem, Ze shmi la'olam, V'ze zichri ledor vador. Yes?
Yes, you instinctively added a vav in between ledor and dor, because that's how we normally say it colloquially, ledor vador. But here in the Torah, it's simply ledor dor, right? The repetition of the noun suggesting the additive va, but it's actually not there. Ze zichri ledor dor. Generation, implying generation to generation.
Isn't that funny? It just went in there in my head.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is a big thing.
Yes. Okay. Vayomer od Elohim, and God said to Moses, Ko tomar b'nei Israel, go and say to the people of Israel, Adonai, that God, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, sent me to you, the Shmila Elam, and this is my name, and this is how I'll be remembered, generation to generation.
Good, right? So it's in this verse that we seem to get the answer that we might have anticipated in the previous verse, which is, who am I? You know exactly who I am. The same God that you've been hearing about throughout your sojourn in Egypt, who appeared to your ancestors and to whom you've been committed, right? So look at that. That ode is very interesting. Vayomer od Elohim. So God, in addition to the, I'll just say it, the sort of weird name and verse in the previous, the weird name in the previous verse, there's, God continues to speak after this either encounter with Moshe in the Midrash or not after that encounter in the Pshat, and says, you know what? There's another name I want you to bring to them. Ko tomar al bnei Israel. This is what you should say to them: the God of your ancestors, of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, is the one who sent me to you. And then this interesting double phrase: Zeh Shemi, this is my name, leolam, forever.
Wait to.
V'zeh zichri, and this is my something, right? My memory doesn't seem to be like something that I God am remembering, or this is the way you will remember me, or this is how you will mention me. The word zecher in Hebrew is hard to actually translate in terms of figuring out whose memory is being discussed. Ledor dor, for or to, generation. Okay. So I already see some hands. Let's see what the kind of questions that might come up on this, and then we'll take a look at the Rashi eventually. Matt, we neither hear you nor see you. There you go. Now we see you. We still don't hear you. No, don't hear you. We see your lips moving. We know you're saying something. I'll come back to you in a second if you can't figure it out. All right, Barry.
Wait, I'm up. I can say what I want to say because it's very short.
Okay.
Door, I think, may be also read as many generations. And I vaguely remember, I think, reading or trying to learn Arabic, and sometimes they do that in Arabic. They double, I think, or some other language, but they double the word, and that means a big plural.
Yeah, and interestingly, in the Aramaic, when Uncle comes to translate it, he adds in the same vav that Sue added in, right? V'dain dachrani, this is my zecher. In Aramaic, the Zion turns to a dalid. L'chol, he adds a chol, dar v'dar, for every generation and generation, right? So is this simply a doubling of generations? Is it a Hebrew phrase that suggests liol me'ad, every generation? And does the vav have to be there? Interesting that it's not necessarily has to be there in Arabic.
It's a multiplying of generations.
Yeah. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.
Barry?
So who is the subject of this sentence? I'm assuming this is God talking to Moshe, but God is saying that Adonai Elohei Avotenu shalachani. So why is God talking in the third person that Adonai sent him, God? It's confusing.
Well, once you get to Kotomar el Bnei Yisrael, such that this is what you should say to the Israelites, everything else is in quotation marks, which is the words that Moshe should say to the Israelites. And since Moshe is going to be referring to God in the third person, when God is feeding Moshe those words, it's in the third person, as it were. So God, say to Moshe, say to the Israelites, the God who is the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, is the one who sent me meaning Moshe, to you. So it's a quote that God gives to Moshe to say, referencing God, but the one who's going to be saying it is not God, but rather Moshe. Right?
But I have an issue with that because it continues on, Zeh Shemi.
Right, so that's probably...
So there's no unquote here. It's a continuation of the previous sentence. The subject of the previous sentence is now saying Zeh Shemi.
Right, so exactly. So either it's that the quotation mark ends at the etnachta alechem. That's the end of what Moshe should say to the Israelites. And now God is saying to Moshe, by the way, Moshe, someone into the room, this is my true name, my forever name, and this is the way I'll be remembered from generation to generation. But you're right. That seems to be God speaking to Moshe, clarifying the name that Moshe is supposed to say, not within the quotation marks of what Moshe is supposed to say to the Israelites. Correct. Elon and then Rebecca, and then we'll get to their hands.
I'm just curious. It seems interesting / odd that God feels compelled to say, "This is my name forever." One would not introduce I wouldn't introduce myself and say, "Hi, my name is Elon. It's my name forever," unless I was Lou Alcindor, in which case, "Hi, my name is Lou Alcindor. It will soon be Kareem Abdul-Jabbar." So I'm curious as to why that's put like that.
Yeah, and why, and what Rashi is going to focus on is less the question of why a God would have to announce that this is my forever name. Rashi is going to focus on the fact that that is said basically twice. Right? What's the difference between Zeh Shmi Le'olam on the one hand and Zeh Zichri L'dor Vador? This is my remembrance from generation to generation. And you're right. That's not how we would. That's not how we would introduce ourselves, unless we wouldn't use those words. Unless maybe it is right. Sometimes we actually want to establish how we want to be known in a certain setting, to be known this way and not that way. I got to think about that if there's a human analog to that. But it is an interesting phrasing. Certainly, the doubling is an interesting phrasing. Rebecca and then Joanna.
My question is sort of related to Elon's question. Really, is why does God have to say, "This is how I'll be remembered"? Does that mean I'm showing up here, I'm going to do something, and I'm going to disappear? The whole issue, the whole notion of remembering rather than just knowing is surprising, especially after is interpreted as "I'll be here now and I'll be here, I'll be with you forever," or in your next troubles as well. So that was surprising to me.
Yeah, so a helpful reminder for all of us, and reminding myself as I say it out loud, that in Hebrew, the root Zayin Kaf Resh is related both to memory and to mentioning, which I suppose are similar concepts. We don't think of it as similar concepts in English because they're different words. But when you mention something, that you are causing yourself to remember it or for it to be remembered, right? When Halakha understands that the mitzvah of Zachor et Yom HaShabbat LeKodsho, right? Remember the Shabbat, the Sabbath day, and keep it holy. How do you fulfill that mitzvah? Anyone know what is the Jewish act that has you fulfill one of the two primary mitzvot of Shabbat? One is Shamor, guard, protect, and one is Zachor, which we would translate it as remember. How do you actually fulfill it? Anyone know halachically? What act on Shabbat fulfills that?
Kiddush, I think.
Kiddush, you think, correct, right? When we say Kiddush and we mention God and mention God having created Shabbat, that is halachically the fulfillment of the obligation of Zachor. So we don't think of Kiddush as a memory moment. We think of it as a recitation. But in Hebrew, they're linked. So when we, and I think conceptually they're linked, we're just not trained to think of it that way because they're different roots in English. So it's unclear because we're just uncovering this word for the first time, as it were, in this class, what even the basic pshat of Zeh Zichri is. Is it my memory, the memory of me, or is it something having to do with how I'm going to be called, a mentioning and a naming, specifically because it seems to be almost like a rhythmic doubling of Shmi and Zichri. So Shmi and Zichri, the fact that both are said, suggests somewhat paradoxically that they're similar, but they're different. They're similar enough to be in a couplet, but they're different enough that it bears having the second one be recited. And Rashi is going to play with that a little bit. And as we'll see, Rashi is going to go in the direction of name and mentioning rather than memory per se. Joanna?
Two words that are jumping out at me. One is when it says Vayomer Od. Normally, like in biblical conversation, when we switch speakers, so we may see, a new Vayomer, but that Od to me suggests one of two things. Either that there was a time lapse between the previous conversation and this one, and if so, why? Why was there need for thought before continuing the conversation, or in some way that this is a different topic. This is going in a different direction. So what is that? And also, V'zeh Shemi Le'olam. So a little bit similar to what's been said, but like, what does that Le'olam add? Even if I have different names that are used in different contexts, they're all they're all always my names, right? What's the difference between having a name and having a name forever? It's your name. Your name is your name forever, even if you have different names or different titles used in different contexts.
Great comments, Joanna. And I don't even really want to hazard a response because those are questions that should linger, and I don't have certainly a dispositive answer to that. I think that the midrashic thrust that Rashi picks up on that adds some layers to the previous verse, which is not necessarily in the pshat, is somehow reinforced by the ode. The suggestion that this was not just that verse 14 didn't immediately get followed by verse 15, and there's something going on in God's own sense of self, such that on a verse level, immediately after God says, "This is my name," God says again, "No, this is my name, and this is the one that I should be called by forever." And by the way, verse 15 is borne out, right? We do not refer to the Holy One in our prayers as Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, but we do refer to Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, right? So it's hard to know which is the chicken and the egg here. Is the reason that we do that because the verse said, "This is my name forever and ever," or did that just kind of happen organically, and does that then get pushed back into our verse? But you're right that the ode suggests that there is some evolution, some stuff happening, rather than an immediate rat-a-tat. My name is this. No, my name is this. There's an extra thing going on there. Great. Tova and then Joel.
I was sort of reacting to the two verses together because it gives me the impression of God starting at a great distance, kind of omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent, the creator, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, and then coming closer and closer as he recognizes the real question has to do with relationship to the people Israel, and therefore the name changes. And it just occurred to me, I don't actually think this is what the Peshat is, but it actually occurs to me that could be an interesting twist on V'zeh Shemi Le'olam. The first name I gave was my name for all time, for all eternity. But V'zeh Zikri L'dor Vador, the name I'll have in the generations in my relation with Israel, is Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov.
That's a really lovely and sensitive read, Tova. I never considered that the two zez at the end of the verse refer not just to the name in this verse, but to both names. And I love how you're kind of shaping the conversation of God introducing God's self first in a vague but important sense of being, and then in the sense of relations. Really, really lovely. Cool. Joel was next.
First of all, I just want to tell you that the chat is still disabled.
The chat is disabled?
Yeah.
You all cannot chat?
No.
I don't know why that is. There must be something deep in my account that got changed, because there's no reason for that, and there's no way for me to change it right where we are right now. But sorry, I'll see if I can figure that out. But I don't know. Go ahead.
I assumed someone was going to say this, which is why I didn't raise my hand originally. And you and Joanna touched on it, got really close. It sounds to me like either a continuation of the same conversation that we had in the last verse, that Moshe says, "Wait a second, why bring up? Okay, so just say Ehyeh." So maybe Moshe is saying, well, that doesn't make any sense. They have no connection with Ehyeh. They don't know who you are. Ehyeh by itself doesn't make any sense. So then God goes further. Okay, fine. So we'll go by this name. You could make the argument, I mean, I don't believe this, but you could make the argument that that's what Rashi is saying all along, because in the previous Rashi it says, Kot Tomar V'Gomer.
It doesn't say what the Gomer is, and he does say Kotomar in both verses. So he could be talking about this verse, although I don't think so.
Yeah, I think you're right that's not what Rashi means, but it's still a worthy comment. Just trying to figure out the tech here. Did you all see what I chatted in the chat?
Yes.
But you can't. It does not allow you to respond.
Correct.
Huh. Okay, I'll try to fix that in my settings. I don't know.
Do you have 3 dots next to your chat on the bottom? If you click on those 3 dots, do you get to something that allows you to enable?
Oh, yeah. Participant can chat with... Okay, now try it. Yay! Okay, now you can all talk to each other and talk behind my back. Hello, Renee. Rick, and then Barry, and then Sue. Thanks, Joanna.
Hi, can you hear me?
And
yes, great. Okay, a couple of things, if I may. I've been waiting to do this. If I can get organized here. So we have, at the end, we have midor dor, lidor dor. Mm-hmm. So in my head, the only other time I have dor dor is at the end of the Purim Torah reading, which is at the end of Bishalach. It's the last 2 words, midor dor. That's dealing with Amalek, and you got to remember him. Remember to forget him, or forget to remember him in generation. Anyway, I just thought I'd throw that in. Okay, trope Josh for Adonai. There's a Ger Shaim there in verse 15. So there's 3 of them. This is the first one where God says, okay, tell the people this. Adonai. So that's the kickoff. That's the trope that word is going to get. Then God of your fathers, God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Okay. Then verse 16. Sorry to read ahead, but it's right there on the page.
I give you I pardon you.
Thank you. Second time. So gather all the people, God says, and tell them this. Adonai Elohei Avotechem near Eli. So and appeared to me. And then you have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay. Then the third time, what are you actually supposed to say to Pharaoh? Verse 18. Adonai, the same thing. And then the God of the Hebrews, because Pharaoh is more interested in the Hebrew slaves than Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, I suppose. Okay. But then when they actually get in front of Pharaoh, they don't use that trope. And it's verse 3 in the next in verse chapter 5. It's in verse 3. It's very calm. Elohei ha'ivrim nik. Oh wait. Where's the Adonai? Well, it's not a Gershon. Here, verse 1. Sorry, chapter 5, verse 1. Koamar Adonai. It's just a mapach bashta. There's nothing more special about it. My gut is that they kind of got standing in front of the court with everybody around. They kind of got intimidated a little bit. Aaron did, maybe. He's the mild one, seeking peace and all that. Maybe he didn't want to confront Pharaoh with a ger shayim, so he just does it slightly with a mapach bashta. But there it is there. And then in verse 3, there's the God of the Hebrews, but the Adonai there is not a ger shayim. But there's something going on with the ger shayim there in these 3 that God is trying to make an impression on Moses as to how he wants to be announced. And then it doesn't go that way. So
That's
thank
great.
you.
I have a couple of responses to that. First of all, this is in no way a critique of people who don't read Torah, but a praise for people who do. When you read Torah a lot, like Rick does, you would just notice things that you wouldn't notice otherwise, because your ear and your neshama are attuned to where the words appear in the Torah. So you're right. Anyone who's sort of a somewhat regular Torah reader sees this verse and says, "There's a verse that I've heard much more often than this verse," and that's the verse from the Purim reading in Bishalach about Amalek. And I remember, maybe you know that before I came to Beth Am, I was for 9 years in a small synagogue in upstate New York, and we read full Kriya every Shabbat. And I individually didn't read full Kriya every Shabbat. I had other laners in the community, but sometimes it fell upon me. And I certainly read some every Shabbat. And the beginning, it was very, very onerous. I remember I've always been a rather good Torah reader, but it was onerous for me on the Thursday or Friday of every week to learn 2, 3, 4 columns well enough to really do it in shul.
Shouldn't have waited till Thursday. Sorry.
Till Thursday, right. Well, you're right. And in fact, later on in my time there, I started davening morning minyan amongst the Satmars in Kiryas Joel. I dropped my kids off at the bus for Schechter, and I'd go to the minyan factory, and I'd get to either the 6:59 minyan or the 7:06 minyan or the 7:11 minyan, and I would sit and drink bad coffee and daven with the Satmars and start practice my Torah reading. And oftentimes, I'm so glad you mentioned that, my drash for that Shabbat would come from something that I came across while preparing the laning, because when you're preparing the laning, you have to see relationship between the words, and the music tells a story. And as Buber wrote, that there are words in each chapter that are light words, these kind of, if you read the chapter, not just every word, but through the prism of certain words that keep appearing, it tells a story about the chapter. And the same thing with the trup, right? So if you follow the Ger Shaims, right, this is not quite Bible codes, but if you follow the Ger Shaims in a particular chapter and then compare it, as you just did, Rick, to how the similar verses are taught in another chapter with different music, it tells a story. And there's a sensitivity to that there's some sensitivity that only comes from the kind of study that we're doing. And there's a sensitivity that only comes from being a regular Torah reader. So I love when you contribute that. I wanted to say one more thing. I love your this sort of fantasy that the music of the verses that we are presented with is the music through which the characters we're going to be acting it out in situ. Right? That's a great notion. That if there wasn't a trup, there wasn't a Ger Shaim on God's name in chapter 5, it means that Aaron wasn't singing a Ger Shaim. But had there been a Ger Shaim, Aaron would have been acting it out in that way. That's a really lovely way of imagining the animation of these characters. So thanks for that comment.
Thank you.
Sue, Barry, your hand was up. It's now down. Okay, Sue.
I think that this is sort of similar to what both Tova and Joel said, but it just is kind of rattling around that when God went from Asher Yeh into Eloi Yaakov, Eloi Yitzchak, who he really is, it's sort of like Tova said, it's a nod to thinking. I mean, this is how we are named. We are named, Shoshana bat Aaron v'Tzipora. This is how we're named, and so he gave us a name to call him that relates to who we are. It tells him who he is in relation to us in our language and how our own names are carried through. And throughout the Torah, everybody's grandfather and that's how we're identified. And so he gave it to us in something that we can take in.
Fascinating. Great. Like a model for how the way God will be known as God's kind of spiritual ancestors and descendants. That's how we should make ourselves known. Norm and Rachel?
I think, when we get to chapter 15, verse 3, we're going to read Adonai Shemot. And I think in light of that, I understand this line as meaning, Moshe, you can tell them it is Adonai. And just who does that? Adonai is the God of your forebears, the God of Avram, the God of Yitzchak, and God of Yankel. And I think it's the trope accentuates the fact that Adonai is the word Adonai, the name Adonai, is a very significant part of this verse. And I thank Rick for that, which inspired me to go find where it said Adonai Shemo right here in the same book.
On the same parsha. I'd also add to that each of those three God's names with a Ger Shaim on them has the following words as Elohei something. Right? So that each, it's like we're introducing this new name for God, and then it's got these various descriptive factors.
Great. So Norm, if I hear you correctly, you're suggesting that the way we almost should be the verses is this way: Kotomar al bnei Israel, speak to the people of Israel. Adonai, Zeshmi leolam, this is my name forever. Zezich l'dor v'dor. And what is Adonai? Adonai means Elohei Avotechem, Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak v'Yaakov. So that those intervening words are kind of a description, but the name that is my name forever is Adonai, as referenced in the song by the sea, Adonai Shemot. Is that how you're reading it?
I am saying that Adonai is the name. I wouldn't say that Adonai is defined by God of the forefathers, but that he is. It's just a way of identifying that who is Adonai? Adonai, he's the God of your ancestors. But that's not the only way we define God. Later on, we'll have 13 attributes. There's lots of ways in which we can explain who God is, maybe even who God isn't. But we call him Adonai, and really, even until this day, we call him Adonai.
Great.
Maybe? Yeah, just earlier we talked about a human analog, and I feel like for a name change being permanent or something like that, and it seems to me that when someone changes their name, whether it's a marriage or a conversion or something else, if they're going to declare that this is going to be my name forever, it's a, statement of extra commitment or something like that. It seems analogous to me.
Yeah, great. Before I call Larry, Diane, your question in the chat about Dor v'Dor Shav. So Zed Dor Shav is from Psalms 24. It's in the psalm that we say when we bring the Torah around, not on Shabbat. Dor v'Dor Shav. I don't know what. Maybe there's a quote from that elsewhere. But Zed Dor Shav is from Psalms chapter 24. Larry and Diane.
I'm a little bit behind and discombobulated.
Why, were you doing something else this morning?
I tried to click on the Zoom as I walked back, but my phone it didn't work for most of the time. And I feel badly because Marshall should be here, but he's probably still on his way back. So in Alter, it's interesting what he does. He takes the last little verset after the Etnachta, and he turns it into verse, which he does quite often. And other books do too. And I admit I'm perplexed as how they know when things are verse and when they're not verse, when they're prose. That's a topic for another time. But here's how he translates it. He doesn't say "and." He says, "That is my name forever, and thus I am invoked in all ages."
Interesting, invoked. Yeah.
And I'm glad you picked up the invoked, because in his comment, what he says is the Hebrew of this brief poetic insert preserves strict grammatical, syntactical parallelism with the previous verset, quote, "and that is my appellation in all ages," end quote. But English synonyms for name, Hebrew zecher, so he's saying that zecher is name, such as appellation, which is the one that's used in JPS, appellation and designation are too ponderously polysyllabic for this little poem. So, and that happens, just my comment is, that happens a lot, especially in the JPS, when I'm reading the Hebrew, and the Hebrew is succinct and clear and sharp and has a big impact on me. And then the polysyllabic, awkwardness of the English translation is especially true in Psalms. Just makes me think,
Of course, the appellation only works for the JPS translation in West Virginia. Otherwise, sorry, had to go there. So Everett Fox, I always like comparing Everett Fox to Alter. He doesn't make that kind of a comment, but in his translation, he's sensitive to Alter's comment. Because Everett Fox says, "That is my name for the ages." That's interesting, for the ages, le'olam, for the ages. "That is my title." He turns zichri to title, which sort of works, right? It's farther away from the zecher root of memory, mention, and appellation, but it's there. He puts in a parentheses from, "That is my title from generation to generation." What I find interesting about the way he writes it is that he doesn't put parentheses around the word to, even though the word to is also not in the phrase, right? As Sue and her soulmate Uncleus inserted the to, but it's not there, right? But neither is the from, and for some reason he decided to put a word, the word from in parentheses, even though in the Hebrew there's more of a sense of a preposition before the first one than in between the two, right? There is a lit door, and he puts the lit as a from in parentheses and throws in the to. He also has a little note on it, and he says for the word that he gives as title, zichri, others, he writes memorial. So that's also interesting. We think of memorial as a word in English that refers to death, but memorial is something that is remembered, right? So a memorial can also be totally disconnected from the concept of death, at least in terms of the shoresh of the word memorial. So the translators are working hard here, and there isn't agreement, and we'll get to Rashi eventually, and he'll thicken the plot. Barry and then Rick.
Rabbi?
Oh yes, please. Sorry, Dan.
Yeah, I just a little comment in the Siddur. In some of the translations, and I think it's Nishmat, but it's probably in other places too, we talk about the remembrance of God as opposed to God. And I'm wondering if somehow, if that's linked somehow to this zichri.
Yeah, zichracha, right? The memory of you, the mentioning of you. Yeah, the root is, it's, I love roots, and it's a great root, Zayin Kaf Resh. The whole Zichronot section of Rosh Hashanah, whenever we try to translate into English, we get tongue-tied. We move to polysyllabic words like remembrances. Doesn't really work, but memories doesn't work either, because it's not, that section really isn't about memory. It's about God's promise to recall us, to be in relationship with us. That's what the Zichronot are. So to translate it as memories doesn't really work. And you're right. When in Tefillah, when we refer to zichracha, the mentioning of you, the memory of you, it has to do with our continuing to recall that you are in our life. So that's related to memory, but it's something bigger than just memory, right? Memory is very amorphous. You ever think about, like, when you're trying to retrieve a memory? I mean, this goes to just the whole theory of the mind in general. You're trying to retrieve a memory, and you can't retrieve it, and then you do retrieve it. What does that actually mean? Does it mean that before you could retrieve it, we discussed this when we were discussing remembering and forgetting. Does it mean that you had forgotten it, and now you remember it, or you'd always remembered it, you just couldn't find it? It's in the wrong file, right? I was at dinner last night, where for some reason we were talking about early childhood memories, and I asked Lev what was his earliest memory. And as I was hearing his answer, I was trying to think, I was in my own head thinking about the process. What's actually happening when someone is trying to remember their first memory? And what does that mean that you remember it, but you don't remember a minute before that? So memory is an amorphous idea, and the Hebrew use of zecher is something more substantive. It's a recalling, it's a telling, it's a recitation, it's saying kiddush, it's being in relationship with, and it's a deeper concept. Barry, and then Rick.
So, door, and echya, asher echya. Echya, I'll use the word becoming, and I referred to this previously in the Zohar interpretation of the Bet of Breshit, is the becoming of creation. There's no end to it. God it's a continuing, always continuing becoming. Yeah. That's what God is. It's always, forever, a continuing, a becoming. And this remember is it's changing our mental channel. Can we get our mental space into that concept that I just expressed? The continuing becoming that God is.
Yeah, great. Let's hear Rick, and then I want to at least do a little bit of Rashi, because we've lingered on the verse, and now I want to resolve some of it through Rashi. Go ahead, Rick.
Hi. Okay, so it's not a trope thing, it's a French thing. My mom was born in Belgium. She learned French. So I, like an idiot, instead of taking Spanish, I took French in high school. But I learned there's different ways to say I am. You can say je suis, or you can say je m'appelle. So the appellation with Larry triggered in my head, je m'appelle. So you can say I am, or I call myself. So the call myself isn't really who you are. It's just something that you want to call yourself to be known as. So I would parallel that with Zeh Shemi, this is who I am, but then I call myself the other one. So I just thought I'd throw that in there.
Yeah, Zeh Zichri does scan well to Je m'appelle, right? Like Je m'appelle is je, I, me, appelle, call. I call myself. Me, a name, I call myself. Fa, a long, long way to run. Okay, back to Sue. Let's look at the first Rashi, which is totally off of our topic and is playing with, I'll just give you, a spoiler, playing with the word le'olam in a way that we hadn't mentioned at all. So go ahead.
Okay, I can't find. Oh, Zeshmi le'olam.
Yeah.
This is the first Rashi in the whole thing, right? Yeah.
This is the first Rashi on the verse, correct.
Chaser vav lomar ha'alimuhu shelo yikare kichtavo, and then where Tzachim nun.
Okay.
Is that it? Tzachim nun. Tzachim nun.
So work with that.
Okay. The word le'olam is missing a vav.
Right, and so there would be a vav normally. When we spell the word olam out, there's a vav in between the ayin and the lamed. And in grammar, a cholom, that's the O sound, that's the long O, cholom malay, full cholom with a vav, and cholom chaser, just the dot without the vav, are pronounced exactly the same. It's not like the difference between a kamatz or a patach, where one is a long one is a short These are both long O's, but without the vav, it gives license to a midrashist to write a midrash in it. So from the fact that the vav is not there, and all of a sudden, if you look at the word without vowels, it doesn't have to be le'olam. It could be le'alem. Le'alem. Ayin, lamed, mem is another wonderful root. It means, in some ways, world and forever. It means a young maiden. And it also means a lack or a disappearance. Lehit alem means to ignore, to not pay attention to. Lo tit alem is one of our obligations in Parshat Ki Tetzei, that to not ignore the suffering of an animal or a person in your presence. Right?
So is ne'alam, it's the same. That's the same shoresh?
Correct. Ne'alamti, I disappeared, right? So in Masechet Shabbat, in the Talmud, there is a long conversation, or maybe it just took us a long time to understand it. It's not even that long, about the notion of, see if I can bring it together concisely. When you commit several transgressions on Shabbat, the question is, what kind of sacrifice do you owe? And it has to do with whether or not your omission or your violation was through one helem, one not knowing, or several helems. Like, did you continuously commit the same violation thinking it was the one thing, or did you keep forgetting that what you were doing was wrong? In which case, those are several violations, right? And it has to do with how many about how many helems, hey, amid, ayin, lamed, mems there are, right? So lacks or omissions or lacuna. So li'alem means to conceal, to make something not known, to make something hidden. Li'alem in the PL. So now read that. Go ahead.
So in modern Hebrew, when you say ani behelim, is that also the same shoresh? No, that's different.
Lamed mem.
Okay, never mind.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm supposed to go back now here.
Yeah. So now try to translate that.
Where am I? Okay, this is zeshmi le'olam. Okay, so it's without the vav, and it means ha'alimuhu, mean something, concealing my name, shelo yikare kichtavo, so that it won't be read. So that it won't be read as it is written. That's why we say Hashem?
Right, exactly. So, well, not necessarily Hashem, but according to Rashi, this is the core idea of why a Jew would never do what the Jehovah's Witnesses do, right? And try to take Yud He Vav He and pronounce it. Like we're sometimes we get afraid to even talk about it. We don't read that as Yeho, right? We don't finish that. That's not how we read it, right? And the whole, sometimes you see Jehovah, written as one of the names of God. That's an attempt, reading the Yud as a J, to put sound to those four letters. Sometimes the way Ever Fox translates Yud He Vav He is just YHWH, right? Not trying to make it into a word, just the letters representing themselves. Rashi says, quoting from Masechet Pesachim, the source for that concept, that we don't know how to pronounce that name, that only the Kohen Gadol knew it, we only recite on Yom Kippur, is here. Because God says, Zeh Shmi Le'alem, this is my name to conceal, or Rashi puts it in the he feel, Ha'alimehu, conceal it from them. Shelo Yikareh, so that it not be said out loud, Kichtavo, as it is written. But rather, how do we read Yud He Vav He? Adonai. Right? So according to Rashi, according to the Pesachim, this is sort of the halachic, midrashic source for the notion that Jews pronounce that word as Adonai. And of course, that has morphed into, some Jews, I think, rather ridiculously. I hope I'm not critiquing anyone on the Zoom. If I am, I take back that word ridiculous. I see no reason, I'll say it that way, to write G/D, right? The English letters G-O-D represent a concept of a divinity. That's not God's name, right? And so there's no reason, from my perspective, to not write out. There's no reason to not cross out G-O-D. There is a reason for us to be protective of the name, and according to Rashi, it's sourced here. Le'alem, not le'om. Okay. Rick, is your hand up from now or from before? Oh. Okay, Joanna.
I find something quite fascinating about this comment in light of, I think it was Tova who said it before, how we take this verse and reading it, the zez, to refer to the two ways God is referred to, because in fact, knowing God as Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh has remained somewhat, has somewhat disappeared or remained hidden, in that it is not something that comes to our forefront, our minds, on a regular basis. Whereas the second way of referring to God as Adonai, Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yaakov, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov is something that is very present and very known to us and very much part of our consciousness and our Zecher.
Yeah, right. Very, very, very much a part of our Zecher, correct. Great. Any other comments on what Joanna just said, or on this Rashi reading cutely le'olam as le'alem? You must conceal it. Okay, then Sue, and we're going to go till 9:45 today for those who can join because we started late. Let's go to the next one.
Okay. Okay, but I'm going to ask kind of the question that might send us whatever. But why are we hiding? Why? Why is it hidden?
Meaning, what's God's motivation for saying
le'alem?
Le'alem. Yeah.
Alimuhu.
Well, what's your own answer to that question?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't have an answer yet. I do have questions. No answer.
Mary Diane Norman.
Okay. I have a name that I called Diane by, having secret, Bear, and it's a name that I call her. And occasionally, other people, I can't even think of an example, have heard me call her that, and then they will call her that. And the reaction is, "Oi, how can you say that name? That's my name for Diane, for my wife, for everything that she is." And for other people to use that name, they can say the word, they can talk about Winnie the Pooh as a bear or whatever, but then to call my wife by that name, there's a yichsa factor even, there's a horrible factor. I don't know why you would possibly want to do that. So in a sense, I want to hide that name, even though I say it. I never call her Diane. If those of you who know me, I always call her Bear, but I don't expect anybody else to use that name.
Neither do I.
And I want to hide. So I understand the hidden, and I also understand the different names of God in different contexts, which is why I'm the guy that gets all hysterical about how people fail to see the distinctions in the various names, appellations, references that we made to the Holy One, blessed be He. That means something very specific in certain contexts. Or as Joanna said, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov. So, yeah, different names for different purposes, and we want to hide some names from other people.
Very evocative. Thank you. Norman and Barry?
I think names have power, as Larry's story illustrates in general, and certainly God's name has great power, so we believe, and so God says, hey, I'm Yod He Vav He, but don't pronounce it that way. Don't give them that name. And we use Adonai when we see Yod He Vav He so automatically that the first 20 minutes of this discussion, nobody talked about Yod He Vav He. We all just referred to that word as Adonai, which is how well ingrained that practice is.
Great. Barry?
So in the way that Moshe asked to see God's face, God says, you cannot see my face. And in the sense that having someone's name gives us a sense of control or power over that person because we know their name. So God's name is, God's self is concealed from us. God is unknowable to us, so don't even try.
Yeah. So I think Barry, I think all those three comments are apt. There is this wonderful and ongoing paradox in our relationship with God, are introduced to that God in the Torah, which is that God beckons us and says, come be close to me. And God says, stay away from me. Right? Come close to the Mount Sinai, stay, and then don't pass that border. Moshe, you are the only one who saw me panim al panim, face to face, but you actually didn't because I didn't permit you to. Right? So there is a bit of a push-pull in the Hebrew dynamic of the relationship between God, which means that, you know, it's that imminent transcendent machloket that Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Ishmael made famous in the Gemara. God is right here by our side. We know God's name. We don't know God's name, but we have so many names for God, right? So La'alem, conceal my actual name, but then you've got the Kadosh Baruch Hu and the Eibishter and the Rabbono Shel Olam and Hashem and Adonai and Eloheinu and Sur, et cetera, right? So we don't know God's name, but there's nothing for which we have more names. We have as many names for God as the Eskimos have for snow. So these are really interesting paradoxes that have been part of our experience of the divine since the beginning, and we're seeing the core kernels of that, right? Remember that we're looking at this as this material has been refracted through millennia, but at least in the verses themselves, right? Rashi's obviously, well over 1,000 years later, but in the verses themselves, we're actually seeing the building blocks for this wonderful and confusing and confused relationship with the divine, right? Our relationship with the divine is harder and more challenging than a Christological understanding of the divine, where it's we know what, the Christians know what their God looks like, and their God felt on the cross. We don't. We're not even sure what to call that God. And that God wants us to call out to that God, but doesn't want us to know the address, the URL, to whom to call out. And that's a complex faith that sometimes makes it hard to know what it is we're grabbing onto. Larry, Diane, raise your hand up. Did you write down? Okay, let's do this because the next You
want me to read the visit?
Read it quickly. We're not going to have time to finish it, but just read it because we're in the middle of a verse. Limdu.
Okay. V'zeh zichri. Limdo.
Limdo, right? Limdo.
Rabbi. Limdo he'ach nikra. V'chein David hu omer. In that psalm. Hashem Shimcha Leolam. Hey, no. What is that?
Yeah, Hashem.
Hashem Shimcha Leolam. Hashem Zichrecha Ledor Vador. There's a va there. Ledor Vador. That's it, right?
Right.
Okay. He this is my memorial. He taught him to call what? He taught him how it is. He taught him how to say it.
Right.
And David, just like David said in that psalm, Hashem Chalulam. The Hashem is the name, is how you'll be called forever. Forever. And that's how you'll be remembered throughout the ages.
Right. So it'll take a little more time to unpack fully, and we'll do that next week. Just two quick comments. One, this, Diane, I think is one of the things you may have been mentioning. This is the Psalm 135, Hallel Hagadol, which we say Sukkot Ezra on Shabbat and Yantav. And in that psalm, we have Adonai Zichrecha. God is your remembrance. God is is the way that we recall you. And there it's Lador Vador. That Vav is there. And the first three words is Rashi saying that what's happening when God goes to Vizichri after Zeshmi is God says, oh, and after I tell you conceal my actual name, well, then you have to know some way to refer to me. V'zez zichri. This is how you should mention it. And according to the tradition, that's where God says to Moshe, pronounce Yud Hey Vav Hey as Adonai. Zez zichri. Zeshmi, but la'alemoto. This is my name. Conceal it. Ze zichri. This is my remembrance. The way you should actually pronounce it. Joanna, was I one psalm off? That's 136. Okay, I may have been one psalm off. So it's the psalm in Pesukei Ezra just before Hallel Hagadol.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.